On a Wednesday morning in early October, with the first bite of real autumn in the air and the smell of turned earth hanging over everything, Dale Harmon stood at the edge of a trench and watched 3 years of his life threaten to disappear into the mud. The trench was 12 feet deep, 40 feet long, and it ran straight through the heart of what was supposed to be his legacy project. Dale had been awarded the contract 8 months prior, a drainage and utility corridor for a new commercial development on the eastern edge of Callaway County, Kentucky. It was the biggest job his company had ever landed, big enough to retire on if everything went right, big enough to break him completely if it didn't, and right now things were not going right. Let me tell you about what was sitting in the bottom of that trench. 2 days before that cold October morning, a section of the trench wall had given way during a rainstorm. Not a catastrophic collapse, more of a slow, grinding slump, the kind that sounds almost gentle until you realize what it has buried. And what it had buried were the rear axles and lower chassis of a Caterpillar 336 excavator, a machine that had cost Dale's company $480,000 when he bought it 18 months ago. It was his flagship piece of equipment, his pride, the machine he'd pointed to when closing the contract, telling the development board that he had the tools to do the job right. Now it sat canted at a 30-degree angle in 12 feet of churned, saturated clay, its cab barely visible above the rim of the trench wall, its tracks buried under what the soil engineers later estimated at 60 tons of collapsed earth. It hadn't moved in 46 hours. It hadn't moved despite 2 other excavators working at the material from either side. It hadn't moved despite a crane hire that cost Dale $6,000 for the day. It hadn't moved despite 4 different rigging attempts, each one ending with either snapped hardware or a terrifying groan from the buried machine that told everyone present to back up immediately. The project was behind schedule. The development board had already sent 2 emails and 1 hand-delivered letter. The penalties for further delay were written clearly in the contract, and Dale's lawyer had already called twice to discuss what those numbers would look like if they hit the 3rd week of overrun. Dale Harmon stood at the edge of that trench and stared down at the mud-streaked yellow cab of his pride and joy, and for the first time in a long, professional life built on relentless forward motion, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Let me tell you about Dale Harmon. Dale was 51 years old, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of permanent tan that comes from spending 3 decades outdoors, and the kind of handshake that tells you immediately he considers himself the most capable man in any room he enters. He had built his contracting business from a single used backhoe purchased on credit in his early 20s into a fleet of 17 machines and a payroll of 32 employees. He drove a 3-year-old pickup truck the color of midnight, kept it detailed twice a month, and wore steel-toed boots that somehow never seemed to accumulate the mud that covered everyone else's. He was not a bad man, let me be clear about that. Dale Harmon was not cruel, was not dishonest, was not the kind of man who kicked dogs or cheated workers out of wages. He was, in his way, generous. He'd sponsored the Callaway County Youth Fair 3 years running and never asked for anything in return except a small sign near the entrance. But he was proud. Lord, was he proud? He was proud in that specific way that men who have built something from nothing sometimes become. Proud in a way that had slowly, quietly calcified from self-confidence into something closer to contempt for any way of doing things that wasn't his way. He believed in equipment specifications, in horsepower ratings, in the reassuring logic of modern engineering. If a problem existed, the solution was more machine, more power, more technology. That was the creed he lived by, and for 30 years it had served him well enough that he'd never had serious reason to question it. Until the trench. His site foreman, a careful man named Terence, had exhausted every conventional option. They had tried direct extraction with the crane. The rigging had held, the crane had strained, and absolutely nothing had moved. They had tried excavating around the buried machine to reduce the load. The saturated clay walls kept threatening to give way further, forcing them to halt. They had tried using the two other excavators in a coordinated push and pull, and on the second attempt they had snapped a 1-inch recovery strap rated to 40,000 pounds as cleanly as a piece of thread. The strap had whipped back with enough force to dent the bucket arm of the assisting machine, and everyone on site had stood in silence for a long moment afterward, rethinking their proximity to the operation. By the morning, Dale stood at the edge of the trench. For what felt like the 100th time, Terence had said the words Dale had never heard him say in 11 years of working together. "I don't know what else to try, Dale." Those 7 words cost Dale 2 hours of sleep that night. He lay awake and stared at the ceiling and ran the numbers again and again. The machine, the delay penalties, the crane hire, the lost billing days. The number at the end of each calculation was the same, and it was not a number he wanted to look at directly. It was on that sleepless night that he made the calls. He called the Caterpillar regional rep, who said the company had never seen a burial quite like this, and suggested Dale contact a specialist recovery firm in Nashville. He called the specialist recovery firm in Nashville, who sent a man named Gerald the following morning. Gerald walked the site for 40 minutes with a clipboard, made several phone calls of his own, and then told Dale that he could have a team and the necessary equipment on site within 72 hours. "How much?" Dale asked. Gerald gave him the number. Dale repeated it back to make sure he'd heard correctly. Gerald confirmed it. Dale sent him home and went back to staring at the trench. It was Terence, of all people, who mentioned the name. He mentioned it almost apologetically, the way a man mentions something he knows will be dismissed, but feels obligated to say anyway. "There's an old fella lives out past Burkhart Road," Terence said. "Elias Cutter. He's been farming that land out there since before most of us were born. People say he's got equipment out in his barn that you wouldn't believe. And they say that when something truly won't move and nobody else can figure it out, Elias Cutter sometimes comes around." Dale looked at Terence for a moment. "How old is this man?" 81, I think. Maybe 82. Dale looked back at the trench. Then he made the call. "Now let me tell you about Elias Cutter." Elias Cutter had been born on the same land he still farmed, in a farmhouse that his grandfather had built with timber cut from the property itself. He was the 4th generation of Cutters to work that particular stretch of Callaway County soil, and if you asked him, which most people eventually did, he would tell you with complete seriousness that he could read the land the way other men read a newspaper. He knew where it held water and where it drained. He knew where the clay ran deep and where the shale came close to the surface. He knew the difference in the way a field smelled in the morning, depending on what the afternoon weather would bring. He was 81 years old, lean as a fence post, with hands so weathered and ridged that they seemed less like human hands and more like something carved from old hardwood. He wore the same style of canvas work pants he'd worn for 60 years, a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow regardless of temperature, and a denim cap so faded that whatever it had once advertised was long past deciphering. Elias Cutter was not a man who complained. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's affairs. He was, as Terence had said, a watcher, a man who had observed the world for 8 decades with the patience of someone who understood that most things eventually reveal their nature if you simply wait long enough. He had watched the farms around him get bought up and consolidated and turned into something a computer in a city somewhere made decisions about. He had watched the old equipment go to the salvage yards. He had watched the knowledge of how to use it go with the men who had used it, one funeral at a time. He did not complain about any of this. He simply went on doing what he had always done, in the way he had always done it, on the same land with the same philosophy that his father had passed to him, that a thing built right does not stop being useful simply because newer things have been built since. He arrived at Dale Harmon's site at 9:30 in the morning, driving a truck that had been old when Gerald of Nashville was still in secondary school. It was a faded green, that truck, with a flatbed behind it, and on the flatbed sat something covered with a canvas tarpaulin tied down at the corners. The truck moved at its own unhurried pace down the access road to the site, and it announced its arrival with a particular combination of sounds. A steady diesel rattle and a light metallic clinking from whatever was beneath that tarpaulin that caused everyone on site to turn and look. Dale Harmon watched the truck come to a stop. He watched the old man climb down from the cab with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who was in no particular hurry and had no interest in pretending otherwise. He watched Elias Cutter put his hands in his pockets, look at the trench, look at the buried excavator, and stand in complete stillness for almost 2 full minutes. Dale walked over. They shook hands. "Terence tells me you might be able to help," Dale said. "Might," Elias said. He was still looking at the trench. "Tell me what you've tried," Dale told him. "All of it. The crane, the coordinated excavation, the recovery straps." He told him about Gerald from Nashville and the number Gerald had quoted. He told it all in the tone of a man who has stopped being embarrassed by failure and has arrived somewhere past embarrassment, in the flat territory of pure practicality. Elias listened without interrupting. When Dale finished, the old man was quiet for another long moment. "The problem," Elias said finally, "is that you've been trying to overpower it. That clay has had 46 hours to consolidate around those tracks. You're not fighting the weight of the machine anymore. You're fighting suction, adhesion. The clay has sealed itself around every surface. You need to break that seal before you pull. You need patience before you need power." Dale studied him. "And you can do that?" "I've done similar," Elias said, which was as close to a boast as the man apparently came. It was at this point that Terence had the tarpaulin removed from the flatbed of the old truck, and Dale Harmon got his first look at what Elias Cutter had brought, and Dale laughed. Let me tell you about that laugh. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a man encountering something so far outside the bounds of his expectations that laughter is the only immediate response available. It came from the same place as disbelief, a short, sharp sound that said, "This cannot be a serious proposal." Because what sat on Elias Cutter's flatbed beneath that canvas tarpaulin was a winch. But not a winch in any sense. Dale Harmon understood the word in his professional life. It was a mechanical ground winch, cable-operated, driven by a separate single-cylinder engine mounted beside it, the whole assembly bolted to a heavy steel sledge frame that was itself strapped to the flatbed. It was painted, or had been painted once, in a dark green that had largely surrendered to rust. The cable drum was enormous, far larger than anything you'd see on a modern recovery vehicle, and the cable itself was wound in thick, even coils that spoke of careful maintenance. The single-cylinder engine that powered it was a piece of machinery so old that Dale's most senior operator, standing nearby, actually said quietly to no one in particular, "Is that a hit-and-miss engine?" It was. Let me tell you about that machine. The winch assembly had been manufactured in 1909 in a foundry in Cincinnati, Ohio, by a company whose name no longer existed and whose plant had been converted to a parking structure sometime in the 1960s. It had been purchased new by Elias Cutter's grandfather, Amos Cutter, in 1911 for for the sum of $240, which at the time represented the better part of a full year's farming income, and which Amos had paid in installments over 3 years. He had bought it for clearing. The cutter land, when Amos had inherited it, was still heavily wooded, and the removal of old-growth stumps, massive root systems from trees that had been growing for 200 years, was the kind of problem that defeated men and horses alike. The winch had been the answer. Amos Cutter had used it to clear 40 acres over 12 years. His son Harlan had used it for similar work on neighbouring properties when asked, and had once famously used it to recover a fully loaded grain truck that had slid into a creek on the old Miller Road during a winter flood, when nothing else had been able to get close enough to the waterlogged bank to help. Elias himself had used it 4 times in his adult life for what he called situations where force of will outlasts force of engine. He had maintained it with the same attention other men gave to vehicles they drove every day. Every moving part had been serviced. The cable had been replaced twice in his lifetime, both times with steel wire rope of the same diameter as the original specification, sourced from the same industrial supplier his father had used. The hit-and-miss engine, so named for its distinctive, irregular firing cycle, which fired only when the governor detected the speed dropping below the required threshold, had been rebuilt by Elias himself in 1987, using a machined replacement sleeve he had ordered from a man in Pennsylvania who was one of perhaps a dozen people in the country still making such components. It was, by every measure Dale Harmon used to evaluate equipment, obsolete. It was slow. It was loud in an irregular, unpredictable way. It had no digital readouts, no load monitoring, no safety cutoffs. It was a machine from a time when the engineering philosophy was different, when the question was not how fast can we complete the task, but how do we build something that cannot be beaten? And it had never, in 115 years of operation, failed to move the thing it was attached to. Dale Harmon did not know any of this when he laughed. "With all due respect, sir," Dale said, composing himself, "I just had a 50-ton crane on this site. A machine that cost more than your whole farm, I'd guess. And it didn't move that excavator half an inch. You're going to pull it out with something that belongs in a history museum?" Elias Cutter looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has heard this particular variety of argument before and found it no more convincing the 100th time than the first. "Your crane was pulling against the suction," Elias said. "Straight up. You were fighting the seal. I'm not going to fight the seal. I'm going to work the machine sideways first, break the clay interface on the track faces incrementally, then redirect for extraction. It'll take time. That engine runs at 220 foot-pounds of torque at the drum, continuous for as long as there's fuel in the tank. It doesn't surge, it doesn't peak, it just pulls. You can't break a seal with a surge. You break a seal with a sustained, patient, unrelenting force applied at the correct angle." He paused. "Your crane gave it one big pull and quit. This machine will pull all day if it has to." Dale stared at him. Then he looked at the winch. Then he looked at his crew, several of whom were very carefully not meeting his eyes. "What do you want if it works?" Dale asked. "A donation to the Callaway County Historical Preservation Society," Elias said. "Whatever you think is fair. And if it doesn't work, then you've lost an hour of daylight and nothing else," Elias said. "And you can call your man in Nashville. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew or thought you knew that the logical, modern, well-resourced answer was the right one, where everything you understood about how the world worked told you that experience and credentials and the right equipment should be enough. And have you ever watched all of that crumble in front of someone who had only quiet confidence and a different way of thinking about the problem? Because that is a particular kind of education. And it doesn't matter how old you are or how successful you've been. When it happens, it finds the same raw nerve in everyone. Dale Harmon said, "Fine." Harmon said, "Do what you can. Let me tell you about the next 3 hours." Elias Cutter did not hurry. He spent the first 40 minutes simply walking. He walked the perimeter of the trench. He studied the angle of the buried machine. He looked at the soil that had been removed in the failed excavation attempts and crouched down and took some of it in his hand and rubbed it between his fingers. He walked to where the winch sat on the flatbed and ran his hands along the cable, checking the coils. He spoke to his grandson, a quiet young man of about 20, who had ridden in the truck and said almost nothing, in low tones that nobody else on the site could hear. Dale's crew watched all of this with the particular restlessness of men who are used to constant noise and motion and are now watching stillness and thought. A couple of them exchanged looks. One of them said quietly that they should have just called Nashville. Then Elias gave his grandson a nod, and the young man began unstrapping the winch from the flatbed. The sledge frame that carried the winch was heavy. Dale's men had to help move it into position, which they did with minimal grace and maximum uncertainty. Elias directed them with hand signals and short sentences, positioning the frame not at the end of the trench where all previous extraction attempts had been directed, but at an angle to the side, roughly 45 degrees to the long axis of the buried machine. Several of Dale's men looked at each other when they understood the geometry of the setup. It was not how any of them would have approached it. Then Elias began setting anchors, not the kind of anchors Dale's crew used. He had brought his own, heavy, buried blade earth anchors of a design that was clearly as old as the winch, driven into the ground with a bar and hammer at specific intervals in a triangulated pattern that spread the reaction load across a wide area of undisturbed soil. This process took another 30 minutes. Nobody hurried him. By now, the skepticism on the faces of Dale's crew had shifted, almost despite itself, into something closer to attention. Then Elias threaded the cable down into the trench and attached it to the rear frame of the buried excavator at a point on the undercarriage that he had identified from above as the optimal load transfer location. He checked the angle of pull 3 times. He adjusted the anchor position slightly. He checked again. Then he crouched beside the hit and miss engine and began the starting procedure. The engine, when it caught, did not sound like anything on Dale Harmon's site had ever sounded. Modern diesel engines are loud in a continuous authoritative roar. The hit and miss engine spoke in a different language entirely, a deep, resonant chuff, chuff, silence, silence, chuff, firing only when it needed to, resting when it didn't, the governor managing the cycle with the same unhurried certainty that characterized everything Elias Cutter did. It was a sound that seemed to belong to a different era entirely, and yet here it was, running perfectly, on a construction site in the 21st century, on a cold October morning. Elias engaged the drum. The cable went taut. Nothing happened, at least nothing that anyone watching could see. The engine chuffed. The cable stayed taut. A minute passed, 2 minutes. Dale Harmon stood with his arms crossed and watched and said nothing. His crew was silent. The only sound was the irregular, patient rhythm of the old engine and the faint, very faint creak of the cable under tension. At the 7-minute mark, Elias made a small adjustment to the angle of the drum using a lever. He did it without looking at anything except the cable. At the 11-minute mark, there was a sound from the trench. It was a deep, low, wet sound. A sound like something giving way that had been held very firmly for a very long time. It was the sound, though nobody on site knew this word for it, of thixotropic failure, of clay that had been under sustained directional stress for long enough that its internal structure had begun to reorganize and release. It was the sound of the seal breaking. Dale heard it and felt the hair on his arms stand up. Terence, standing 3 feet away, said very quietly, "There it is." The buried excavator moved. Not much, perhaps 4 inches, perhaps 6. But it moved, and everyone saw it move, and the crew, the same crew that had exchanged skeptical looks 40 minutes ago, erupted in a sound that was half cheer and half something that had no clean name, a release of 46 hours of frustration and anxiety and the particular dread of watching expensive equipment disappear into the earth. Elias Cutter did not react. He made another adjustment to the drum angle. He let the engine run. What followed was the most methodical extraction Dale Harmon had ever witnessed. Elias worked the buried machine sideways along the trench floor in small increments, each one accompanied by more of those deep, releasing sounds from the clay, each one freeing a little more surface area from the suction that had held the tracks sealed for 2 days. He changed the cable attachment point once, climbing into the trench himself to do it with a calm that made his grandson visibly nervous and made Dale Harmon hold his breath. He redirected the angle of pull twice. He never increased the engine speed. He never forced anything. He simply maintained that steady, unrelenting, patient force, and the clay, which had defeated a 50-ton crane and 2 modern excavators and the best thinking of a specialist firm in Nashville, slowly, inevitably, and completely gave way. 1 hour and 53 minutes after the engine had started, the Caterpillar 336 was pulled clear of the collapsed trench wall and sat on firm ground, tilted but upright, its tracks crusted in clay, its cab scratched but intact, fully recoverable. Elias shut down the engine. The hit and miss fired its last cycle. Chuff, silence, and then nothing but the sound of autumn wind across the site and 32 men being very, very quiet. Elias Cutter walked to the recovered excavator. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pulled a red shop rag from his back pocket, wiped his hands and turned to his grandson, who was already beginning to break down the anchor system. Dale Harmon walked over. He stood next to the old man and looked at the machine that should not have moved. He stood there for a while without saying anything, and when he spoke, what he said was not what he had planned to say. He had planned something pragmatic, something about clearing the paperwork and getting back to schedule. Instead, what came out was simply, "How?" Elias Cutter looked at him for a moment. "You were asking the wrong question," he said. "You kept asking how much force. The right question was where and when and how long." Dale nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand it yet. He would spend a week understanding it. The following morning, Dale Harmon drove out past Burkhart Road before 7 o'clock. He found the farm easily enough. It was the kind of property that looked exactly like what it was, land that had been worked with patience and respect for 4 generations, with a barn that was as old as the county and a farmhouse that had been repaired so many times and so carefully that every section of it was from a different decade. Elias was in the barn when Dale arrived, doing exactly what he would have been doing regardless of any of the previous day's events. Running an oil-soaked cloth along the cable of the old winch, recoiling it with the same care another man might give to a fine instrument. Dale said what he'd come to say. He said it plainly and without qualification, the way a man who has decided to apologize properly actually does it. He said he'd been wrong to laugh. He said he'd been wrong in a way that had less to do with the specific situation and more to do with a habit of thinking he'd built up over 30 years, a habit he was only now seeing clearly. He said he was grateful. Elias listened. When Dale was done, the old man set down the cloth and was quiet for a moment, looking at the winch. "My grandfather bought that machine," Elias said, "because he had stumps to clear and a family to feed and not a lot of margin for elegant solutions. He didn't buy speed, he bought stubbornness, he bought something that would grip when everything else slipped and pull when everything else snapped. He didn't care how it looked, he cared that it worked." He paused. People built things differently then, not because they didn't know any better, because they were answering a different question. Dale wrote a check to the Callaway County Historical Preservation Society for $10,000. He had meant to write $5,000, but when it came down to it, $5,000 hadn't felt like the right number. Let me tell you about the years that followed. Elias Cutter became, in the way that quiet men sometimes do, a small legend in Callaway County. Not because he sought it, he never sought anything of the kind, but word travels on its own in communities that size, and the story of the buried excavator and the old winch and the man who moved what a 50-ton crane couldn't reach to fair number of ears in the months after that October morning. He was called twice more in the following 5 years, once for a situation involving a collapsed retaining wall and a buried drainage vault, and once for a problem on a highway improvement project that the project engineers had been arguing about for 3 weeks. Both times the result was the same. Both times the check that followed was larger than asked for. Dale Harmon finished the Callaway County drainage project, recovered his schedule within 3 weeks, and took the development board out to dinner when the project delivered on time. He was not the same contractor after October as he had been before it. Not dramatically different, and he still drove the midnight blue truck, and he still won contracts by knowing his equipment and his team. But there was something in the way he approached a problem that had changed. He listened more at the start. He asked what had already been tried. He was slower to assume that more power was the answer. He told the story of Elias Cutter and the winch to his project managers every year at the company's winter meeting. He told it the same way every time, without embellishment, and he ended it the same way every time too, with the same sentence. "The man had a machine older than my grandfather, and he moved something we couldn't touch." Ask yourself why before you ask yourself how much. Elias Cutter died on a Sunday morning in late March, 12 years after that October. He was 93 years old. He died in the farmhouse his grandfather had built, in a bedroom that looked out over the south field, which was greening up for the year the way it had greened up every spring, for as long as anyone could remember. The funeral was held in the county at the same church where 3 generations of Cutters had been baptized and married, and it was attended by more people than the building could comfortably hold, many of them with no obvious reason to be there beyond the fact that a life like that one deserves to be properly witnessed at its close. Dale Harmon sat in the 3rd row. He was 63 years old by then, grey at the temples, a little slower through the parking lot than he used to be. He sat and he listened, and he thought about a cold October morning and a cable going taut and a wet, deep sound coming up from clay. The winch passed to Elias Cutter's grandson, the same quiet young man who had unstrapped it from the flatbed on that morning 12 years before. His name was Samuel Cutter, and he had grown up working the family land and had been present at enough of his grandfather's situations to understand, in a way that went beyond instruction, how the machine worked and why it worked and what it was actually doing when it did it. Let me tell you about the morning Samuel Cutter got the call. It was a Wednesday in early October, the same season, different year, and the voice on the other end of the phone was young and tense and belonged to a project manager named Harmon. Not Dale Harmon. Dale Harmon's son Marcus, 29 years old, running his first major project for the family company on the eastern edge of Callaway County, a project that had gone wrong in a way that Marcus was not yet experienced enough to have anticipated. A section of the trench wall had given way during a rainstorm. Marcus had tried the crane, he had tried 2 excavators, he had tried a specialist recovery firm. He was out of options and out of time, and the contract penalties were written in the same clear language his father had stared at 12 years before. Someone on his crew, an older operator who had been with the Harmon Company for a long time, had said, almost apologetically, that there was a cutter boy out past Burkhart Road who sometimes came around when something truly wouldn't move. Marcus called the number. Samuel Cutter arrived at 9:30 in the morning, driving an old truck with a flatbed behind it. On the flatbed, beneath a canvas tarpaulin tied at the corners, sat a mechanical ground winch, single-cylinder hit-and-miss engine, cable drum, steel sledge frame. Marcus Harmon watched the truck come down the access road. He watched the young man climb down from the cab and put his hands in his pockets and stand at the edge of the trench and look at the buried machine in silence for almost 2 minutes. He walked over. They shook hands, and Marcus Harmon, who had heard this story every year of his life at the company winter meeting, who had heard his father tell it in the same words with the same ending, who had believed he understood it, looked at the old winch under the canvas and felt, despite everything, the first flicker of doubt cross his face. Because understanding a lesson and having it tested against your own skin are 2 different educations. Samuel Cutter saw the look. He recognized it. He had been told to expect it. "My grandfather moved one of your father's machines," Samuel said. 12 years ago. October. Same kind of situation." Marcus nodded. "Oh no," he said. "I've heard the story." "Then you know how it ends," Samuel said. He was already walking toward the trench, hands in pockets, studying the angle of the buried machine, reading the soil, reading the situation, doing exactly what his grandfather had taught him to do, looking first, moving second, and never, under any circumstances, confusing force with wisdom. Some things don't become obsolete, they just wait for people to remember why they were built.